Good morning. Try again. Good morning. My name is Thomas Hicks, and I'm chairman of the United States Election Assistance Commission. We are honored to be hosting the third annual Language Access for Voters Summit in partnership with the Democracy Fund Voice and Arizona State University's Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service. We held our first Access Summit in 2016, and we are excited to be carrying the momentum forward today. Thank you all for joining us here today in the audience, and those of you watching the event online. According to the U.S. Census Bureau data, there are more than 25 million people in the United States with limited English proficiency, and more than 60 million, or nearly 1 in 5 people in the United States who speak a language other than English at home. Such individuals can face challenges when attempting to register to vote and cast a ballot. From translated materials to bilingual assistance at the polls, election officials across the country take a number of steps to help voters overcome language barriers and participate meaningfully in the election process. In certain jurisdictions, such assistance is required by language provisions in the Federal Voting Rights Act. We at the EAC have worked to support language access since the agency was established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002. The EAC has provided states with HAVA funds to strengthen their language assistance programs. Our agency offers national voter registration forms in Spanish and 8 Asian languages. The EAC has created glossaries of election terminology that translate into Spanish and several prominent Asian languages. And of course, the EAC hosts events such as this, where election officials, advocates, and stakeholders from language communities come together, share their experiences, and learn from one another about how to better serve voters with language needs. Additionally, the EAC plans to release a new accessible resource early each month that outlines good practices and seeks to help election officials meet their language requirements under the Voting Rights Act and better serve voters. We have lined up some excellent speakers for you today, including election officials, advocates, and election stakeholders who support language in multiple languages in dozens of states, from Alaska to Florida to California to Massachusetts. Today's speakers come from all corners of the country. We are honored to have with us today representatives from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, the Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office of the U.S. Census Bureau. We are also fortunate to have Leonie Garcia, Secretary of State from Rhode Island, with us today. But before we get started, a few housekeeping things. First, silence your phones. If you're a social media user, we encourage you to post on the summits online using the hashtag LanguageAccess18, and there will be opportunities throughout the day for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. When doing so, we politely ask you to do 3 things. 1, speak into the microphone so folks watching online can hear your question. 2, identify yourself. And 3rd, and most importantly, ask a question. If you need any assistance throughout the day, please find a staff member from the EAC, Democracy Fund Voice, or Pastor Center, and we'll all be happy to help you. Thank you again for coming, and let's give a special note of thanks to the election officials who are in the room today. And finally, I would like to offer my sincere appreciation to our partners at the Democracy Fund Voice and Pastor Center. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Alberto Olivas, the Executive Director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service at the Arizona State University. Thank you once again for you in the audience today and your commitment to secure, accurate, and accessible elections. Thank you. All right, have fun.
Thank you, Chairman Hicks. My name is Alberto Olivas. I'm the founding executive director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service at Arizona State University. And as the newest partner in putting on this summit, Arizona State University is incredibly excited and honored to be part of this partnership with the Election Assistance Commission and Democracy Fund Voice. The work of the Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service is all about helping students learn the skills of effective political and electoral engagement. I come to this work having been previously an election worker. I was a voter outreach director I was the first voter outreach director in Arizona under Arizona Secretary of State Betsy Bayless. And one of the things that I learned in that work is that voting is often what people think of when we talk about civic engagement and the need to increase civic participation in our communities. People immediately think of voting. And one of the things I learned is that voting is really the end result of an engaged citizen. That voting doesn't just happen magically because you have citizenship status, that it is a result of being informed and feeling connected to your community and feeling and understanding what's at stake with the election outcomes. So voting is what happens when we've done a good job at helping people understand their rights and their roles as citizens, but it is also the front door to citizenship. Especially when we're thinking about our newest citizens, it's critical that we get it right for our newest citizens, those turning 18 and voting for the first time, those who have gone through the naturalization process and now newly have the right to vote. It is so important that their first experience with our election system goes well, because we know that if it doesn't go well, we significantly impinged on their likelihood of continuing to vote or voting in the future. So how do we do that? This is what today's summit is all about, or all of the best practices, all of the strategies, all of the values and priorities that need to go into designing the work of providing support and language access for those newest citizens. It's important that we think about how we describe this work, how we help those who may not understand the importance or the need to provide this sort of access to language access and support for voters, so that they can understand what value that has for all of us, for our wider democracy. One of the things that I found, however, is that people engaged in this work, I think, find a joy and a fulfillment in doing this. We need to talk in fully human terms of why it matters and what the result is of engaging communities that have not felt engaged before, of reaching out to communities that for different reasons have felt left out of our systems. So that's why today matters, and we're so pleased to see so many of you here today and so many of you watching online. We have a lot to learn from each other and a lot to share with each other, and we're excited to be a part of this. So thank you to Election Assistance Commission and Democracy Fund Voice for allowing Arizona State to be a partner with you in bringing today's event to fruition. Thank you very much.
Good morning. So I'd like to start by thanking our partners, EAC, the wonderful staff at the EAC, as well as the commissioners themselves, Alberto and his team at ASU. My name is Terry Minnis. I am a senior fellow and consultant to Democracy Fund Voice and their election program. And I'm very excited to be here with you all today. Democracy Fund Voice is a young, nonpartisan organization dedicated to helping America build a stronger and healthier democracy, one that is responsive to the public and able to meet the greatest challenges facing our nation. Democracy Fund Voice advocates for solutions and institutions that work to improve and support election administrators with better processes, because we believe that voting is the cornerstone of democracy. We also believe that every eligible American should have an equal opportunity to vote, free, accessibly, and securely. And in fact, this belief fueled our decision to come together with EAC to start having these language access summits. As Chairman Hicks mentioned, this is the third iteration of the summit, and it is an opportunity for us to all come together and have a great dialogue. In fact, from day one, we've been committed to bringing together election officials, community advocates, other stakeholders for a dialogue about how we can best serve voters with language needs. And each collaborative summit has been an opportunity to grow and deepen our discussion about language access needs. One of the best moments from our first summit was actually from the former president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, Mi Mua, who shared her family's refugee story to the U.S. I encourage you to go back and check out her summit talk if you have some time. It's personal stories like hers that really kind of give the rich texture to the work that we do in trying to assist voters with language needs. These events also can inspire other local events. We heard about the very successful Language Summit that happened in Alaska earlier this year. And we recognize that this is an organic process, right? That how we best serve language minority communities is not a one-size-fits-all for everybody. And that's why it's so important for us to have these dialogues and why we're committed to continuing these summits in partnership with the ACA as well as other partners like ASU, like all of you out in the audience and our election officials. I'll close my remarks with this thought. As someone who's been doing this work for almost 2 decades, these summits are particularly special to me. Prior to these summits, it often felt like there wasn't much attention paid to issues for language minority voters, right? And in fact, even if there were some discussion, there wasn't a lot of care. You know, sort of an afterthought or a throwaway, or we'll get to it when we can. So it's been very critical to me that we have this space to have this conversation, right? Previously, if there was any discussion about language access needs and language assistance, it was sort of framed in the negative and sort of what wasn't being done right. And while I think it's always important to lift up areas where improvements can be made, I also think it's equally important to lift up where things are going right and where things could potentially be replicated in others. And that's why I think that this summit is so critical, right? We've really built a community of people who all share the same goal of ensuring access for all voters with a particular focus for those with language needs. And being here together, allows us to really try to break down the barriers, discover innovative ways to best serve language minority voters, and really build a better tomorrow for all. And with that, I think I will ask my panelists to join. I don't have to get mic'd up twice, so this is a nice treat for me. But please join us for the first panel. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm sitting in the wrong seat. Okay. So, I have to switch my electronics because my one just failed. So we are starting today's conversation with a discussion about sort of an overview of Section 203 and language access needs, sort of what it means to be covered, how can that play out locally, as well as sort of some overarching thoughts and tips about merging needs, as well as where we can potentially address these needs. So we will, give me one quick second, sorry. So today we are speaking with, first, James Whitehorn, who is with the Census Bureau's Redistricting and Voter Data Office, correct? The chief of, almost. And then James has been there since 2006, I believe, and runs both the redistricting program as well as runs the work on doing the actual Section 203 determination. So we'll be hearing from him about how that sort of plays out. Next, we have John Yang, who is President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And he will talk us through some of the demographic landscape of the language minority communities and sort of different ways to look at the needs in the community so that we're making sure we're actually addressing, those who have the most vulnerabilities and the most needs. Next, we'll hear from Julie Barker, who is with Clark County Election Office. And she will walk us through, and in fact is through her many roles. I believe your bio says that you've been there since 1994.
Correct, yes.
She also helped implement both the Spanish and Tagalog language program, so very excited to hear her talk us through the nitty-gritty, the actual on-the-ground experience of what does it mean to be covered, and what do we think about in trying to figure out, how to best serve this population. And finally, we will hear from Rosalyn Gold, Senior Policy Director. Did I get
Close
that?
enough.
Close enough. So with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials Education Fund, and she will talk us through some of the emerging trends in language needs and language access and some ways that we can try to address those needs. And with that, and then after our panelists speak, we will open up for a Q&A from the audience and look forward to kicking off this discussion for, trying to frame, I guess, the discussion for the entire day and sort of how we can move the ball forward in making sure that all voters are getting the access they need. So I'll start with you. Yes.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to try to move really quickly through my slides because I want to make sure I stay within my time limit so that we have plenty of time for the question and answer period towards the end. But I'm really appreciative to be here again this year. I was there last year in Annandale, and it was a great experience. So I've been told that there are some people who are experts on this subject, and there's also people who this may be new to here. So I thought it'd be good to start with a short refresher about Section 203 before I get into Census's role. Section 203 being part of the Voting Rights Act that requires states and other political subdivisions to provide language assistance to voters when the need for that assistance is established through the criteria that's indicated in the law. It puts requirements on the director of the Census Bureau to evaluate that need and then create what we call a determined list. So I'll often say if an area is determined is sort of the language we use. The law identifies specific language groups that need to be considered for this required assistance. There's Spanish, the American Indian and Alaska Native languages, and the Asian languages. However, the Bureau has to look at the single language minority when doing our evaluation. So then that becomes Spanish, the component languages of the American Indian, Alaska Native languages, and the component languages of the Asian groups. One important point that many people don't realize about the way the Census Bureau goes about doing these calculations is that when we look at language minority groups, we're actually using race as a proxy for the language. So for 2011 and 2016, this created 68 language minority groups. And it's important to note that that could change. I haven't heard anything that's going to change, but that could change for 2020 should that list of detailed language groups or detailed race groups change for the 2020 census. It's also important to note that sometimes this creates things that are slightly strange because we purposely use the list as it is when we create the determinations. And because of that, we end up with things like sometimes you'll have a category such as some other Asian. Not very descriptive. So we will then reach out. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, we work with the jurisdiction to then go back and look at some of the data we have behind the scenes to try to help them understand who actually is causing that to trigger. So the determinations are based on several characteristics that used to be gathered by the long form of the census, but now is currently gathered by the American Community Survey, the continuous American Community Survey. There's the language minority group category I just talked about. There's the ability to speak English. We have to evaluate limited English proficiency, and that's done through part of a question that asks how well someone speaks English, and they can say very well, well, not well, or not at all. Anyone who says less than very well is considered part of the group that gets evaluated. It's also important to look at what they call the illiteracy rate. In Census Bureau terminology, that's anyone who has less than a 5th grade education. And then this is all conducted on the subset of voting age citizens. Then this evaluation is done on the state level. It's done on the county level for most states. There's a handful of states where it's actually done on the town or township level. We call that a county subdivision. And that's because that's where the functioning level of government is. There's also a special consideration for American Indian and Alaska Native areas, but I'm going to get to that in another slide. So for just a quick historic background, the determinations were published in 1977 for the first time. This was based on the addition of Section 203 to the Voting Rights Act in 1975. They came from the 1970 census data, and there was no English language proficiency criteria at that time, but there was also no English language proficiency criteria or question in the census at that time. So then the next round was published in 1984. That did have the English language proficiency criteria added through amendments to 1982 to the law, often referred to as the Nichols Amendment from the senator from Oklahoma. And then in 1992, we published the determinations again. This area we had an addition of a 10,000 population threshold and the American Indian and Alaska Native trigger. That's the criteria that we used then and we continue to use today. The next big change was in 2006 with the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. They added the change from the long form to the American Community Survey, and they asked us to do these determinations every 5 years. So I won't go into the calculation too much just for time, but it's basically you evaluate for a 5% or 10,000 trigger and the illiteracy rate combination. And you do that for all the states and the counties and townships that I mentioned. But then there's this second criteria, which is we evaluate the American Indian and Alaska Native areas. If they trigger the formula, the reservation or area doesn't become triggered. Any of the intersecting counties or townships that intersect that area become triggered. So they become determined and have to provide that language support. So now I want to get into some specifics about how we handle the current determinations. And I have to introduce a concept called a direct estimate and a modeled estimate. When we publish a number from the long form of the census or from the ACS, it's what we refer to as a direct estimate. It's directly from the survey calculated response. And the ACS, the American Community Survey, is very transparent in that they produce a margin of error for every data cell that they produce that allows you to know the level of uncertainty around that number. So with the switch to the ACS, which is the source for these calculations now, and expanding confidence in our statistical methods, Director Groves, who is the Census Bureau director, a couple directors back, he was over us when we were doing the 2011 determinations. He asked us to review if we could do modeling to improve the variance on those values. We did a rigorous review through our research and methodology department, and we had a criteria review of a 20% improvement in the variance, and we actually exceeded that greatly. So we went ahead and we started using modeling, small area modeling, for these determinations, and we continued to do that in 2016. The difference being in 2011, we had a census right near it, so we used that to sort of weight the ACS to current population levels, and then we had to tweak the formula for the latest round because we were in the middle of the decade and we no longer had that. So the main effect of that, what that does is, if for a large area with a significant population, the model doesn't really do anything. It just sort of, we rely almost directly on the direct estimate. It's for those very small areas that have small sample size, small populations that still need to be evaluated to see if they have this need. The model will tend to rely more on the regression estimate that's involved. And so then, how can you be involved? Terry was in touch with me before we did the latest round, and she asked that very question, and she was very helpful in identifying some things that we had produced in the past as sort of supporting documents, some comparison tables, things to help people digest what's happened, what's changed, what does these new determinations mean. And so we worked together and took those suggestions, and we produced sort of a more robust set of those support documents. The overall process of doing the calculations is fairly internal to the Census Bureau, but one of the things we do is we publish a public use file, which has all the calculations, except for a few that have to be suppressed for privacy concerns. And I know of at least one county that was determined for a language, and they went and looked at that public use file, and they found another language that almost hit the 10,000 trigger and missed it by 200 people. And they thought, while we're going through this process of doing the translations and engaging a contract, let's just add that one in, because we know this is a growing population in our county, so we might as well cover this now. So that's one of the things that you can do proactively. And then if anyone has technical background or has access to people who have statistical backgrounds, and we publish the methodology papers for these, I put them on our voting rights webpage. So any feedback that you have from someone doing a review of that, if they send it to my office, I'll make sure it gets to the researchers when we start this again in December of 2019. We'd be more than happy to take that feedback and make sure that that gets considered. And then making sure that the communities that are affected understand what the ACS is and that you encourage them to respond and respond fully to that so that we have the best starting level data. And then as an old geographer, I'd be remiss to also say, making sure you engage with Census geographic programs, specifically the Boundary and Annexation Survey and the Tribal Boundary and Annexation Survey, because all these calculations are based off the boundaries we have in our Tiger database, and if your boundaries aren't correct, we're not going to be measuring your population correctly. And so that, I will kick it back to Terry for the group, but I just wanted to, I look forward to the question and answer period later. Thanks.
Okay, very good. Hopefully this will work, or do we need to load, or is it? This should just be pressing this, right?
Yeah, you just press the green button, so they may need to queue it up.
Okay. Right. Well, while we're queuing it up, just to, oh, there we go. Excellent. Just like magic. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do is just walk everyone through data. One of the things I just love doing is just talking about what the data looks like. And so we're going to give you an overview of what the data looks like right now for a limited English population, and sort of where the language needs are. And then we'll talk about some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, so that gives you a framework for the rest of the day in terms of how you go about doing your work. Certainly what James talked about, this is a great start in terms of understanding all of this. So with respect to what the data looks like, clearly there is a growing need. In terms of the limited English proficiency population, it is growing. If you look at compared to 2010, we've grown by about 6 million at least. I always say at least because obviously when you're talking about counting these types of populations, it is very, very difficult. As Chairman Hicks alluded to at the beginning of his presentation, this translates into about 1 in 5 Americans that have limited English proficiency needs. With respect to the definition of limited English proficiency, I think this, Chairman Hicks also set that out, but I think it's important to emphasize. And that is that it's speaking English less than very well, and that they speak an English language other than English at home. Why this is important is because oftentimes I get asked the question, well, if people say that they speak English well, isn't that good enough? But the reality is, and all of you probably understand this, is someone that's asked on a survey, how well do you speak English, especially if they are an immigrant, they're naturally going to overestimate or overcompensate and say, oh no, I speak it very well. I mean, that's just and I know this from my own personal experience growing up as an immigrant. It's just a defense mechanism that you have. And so this definition makes a lot of sense in that context, that if you are answering other than less than very well, then there is going to be a deficiency. And this is even something that's been tested by the Census Bureau in terms of how well people test when they're checking off very well versus less than well. So certainly anyone that speaks English less than very well is someone that has language assistance needs when it comes to voting. And the other piece of data that's useful at a general level to keep in mind is that to think about sort of what the LEP population is overall versus the LEP population which speaks a language other than English at home. So overall, the overall population is maybe about 8.5% or so. But then when you break it down into people that speak English less than very well and speak a language other than English at home, that increases to about 40%, a little bit over 40%. And so what that means, again, it's another way of emphasizing that the needs are quite great, and it's something that we need to consider as we're going through these exercises. This has already been covered in terms of what Section 203 covers with respect to different populations. So it covers Latinos, Asian Americans, American Indians, and Alaska Natives. And this is because Congress has continually found that these groups have faced significant barriers when it comes to voting. Another thing that sort of oftentimes I get asked in our line of work is, well, shouldn't a person be able to speak English in order to vote? And that's something that frustrates me, because number one is we are talking about people generally that speak English. But number two is, Just as someone is not less of a citizen because they have a handicap and need some sort of aid at the ballot box because of a handicap, it is the same with respect to a person that speaks English less than well. They're not less of a citizen simply because of that reason. So in terms of what some of this data looks like with respect to the CVAP population, as you can see, it is, oops, did I, hold on. Or do I have to go? Oh, yeah, okay. Got it, okay. With respect to the different populations that we're talking about, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.7 million for Asian Americans, 350,000 for American Indians, Alaska Natives, 16.6 million for Latinos. So what that translates into, at least for the Asian population, is again, it's about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 that have language needs. And I apologize for rushing a little bit because I definitely want to get to questions as well. With respect to sort of the different language groups, this sets it out in terms of percentage-wise what we're looking at. In terms of the Asian Americans, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and Latino population with respect to LEP populations. If you look at it by state, these are where it starts getting interesting with respect to percentage of people who speak another language. Certainly, if you're just looking at straight-out percentages, wait, we should have one that's, oh, got it, okay. Straight-out percentages, then there's a little bit of a cross-section all over the map. Certainly, California ranks very, very high up there in terms of total. But then if you break it down into the different populations, you get quite a different set of states that are covered. And there are some commonalities like Illinois, some commonalities like let's see, like I think Pennsylvania comes up in a couple of different places, but there's not a uniform amount. But then if you look at it in terms of numbers of LEP persons, then it becomes much more uniform. California ranks at the top for all populations. Texas ranks in the top 2 or 3 for all populations. And then you start to have a smattering of different groups. And this is, again, another breakdown by percentage, by top 10 states by percentage of LEP persons. Again, California ranks at the top if it's overall. But if you break it down into different ethnicities, you see New York does still rank up there for all 3 groups in different orders. New Jersey comes up for the American Indian, Alaska Natives, and Latino populations. Rhode Island comes up there as well. But then there's different commonalities that you will see. And then this is another way of showing just top 10 states by percentage of those who speak a language other than English plus are limited English proficient. I think it's, again, interesting to note that it's just a lot of different jurisdictions that are covered. With respect to opportunities beyond Section 203, there's a number of just missed jurisdictions to note. Certainly in New Mexico for Latinos and Hawaii for Filipinos. And then with respect to the numerical threshold, again, there's there's quite a number of different jurisdictions that are covered. And I could give you the full list here. And I think these slides will be distributed to everyone, so everyone will be able to see in much more detail what this all looks like. I think the last thing I want to say, as I'm running out of time, is just with respect to the census. And that is that obviously all of this data does come from the census. And we need accurate data, whether it's accurate data in the decennial, but then certainly accurate data in the ACS. And that's going to be critical. As we come upon the 2020 census, there are a lot of challenges that all of you guys know that we are facing, from federal funding for the Census Bureau itself, for them to do their job correctly and accurately, to things such as the climate of fear with respect to the anti-immigrant rhetoric that is out there. This is also going to be the first high-tech census. Now people are going to be encouraged to fill out their forms online. What that means with respect to fears about privacy of data is going to be great. So all of us have a vested interest in making sure we get the census right, because that's going to drive what this data looks like with respect to the LEP populations and Section 203 coverage. So let me stop there, turn it back over to Terry, and then I will answer questions.
Thank you, John. Cue up that next.
Good morning. I will be discussing exactly what Clark County does in regard to facilitating voting by LEP voters. I'll give you some background first on Clark County and what we have been doing as far as outreach, voting equipment, voting sites, poll workers, translation, and our printed materials. Some facts about Clark County. We have about almost 1.2 million voters. We have 70% of the voters in the entire state. We just went to vote centers this year. We have 172 vote centers. We have 90 early voting sites that we utilize over a 14-day period before Election Day. Our staff is 37 full-time employees. And the population of Clark County is a bit over 2.2 million, and it is 8,000 square miles. So we first had to start providing materials in Spanish in 2002. And at that point, we provided everything in both Spanish and English, such as sample ballots. Everybody received a sample ballot that contained both Spanish and English. In 2011, we were mandated to start preparing materials in Tagalog. At that point, we had to stop preparing materials in all three languages. It was just going to be cost prohibitive to put everything in English, Spanish, and Tagalog. So the persons who receive their sample ballots in Spanish and Tagalog are those who have specifically requested to receive them in those languages now. In 2017, the Nevada legislature passed a bill authorizing election officials to provide foreign language materials to persons or in languages that are not mandated by federal law. So what we did is we prepared our first Chinese language brochure at that point, and we are anticipating after the 2020 census that we may need to start providing materials in Mandarin. As far as community outreach, we are doing a few different things. What we first started doing with the Latino community is we contacted the Spanish language media to identify the leaders and groups, and that was El Mundo newspaper. We contacted the Latin Chamber of Commerce and groups that register voters, such as Mi Familia. As far as identifying Filipino groups and leaders, we contacted Asian media, such as the Asian Journal, the Asian Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Filipino American Association, and some other organizations. So that helped us identify the leaders and groups that we needed to direct our outreach to. Our outreach is proactive and it includes a lot of voter education. So this includes after general elections, we meet with these groups to find out what we can do better and to formulate improvements. We have voting machine demonstrations at registration events, and we also distribute information at these events as well. One thing that we found was that once the word got out that the election department was ready, willing, and eager to provide outreach, these groups and leaders started contacting us in very large numbers, and we were very happy about that. As far as voting equipment, all of it needs to be able to accommodate currently Tagalog and Spanish-speaking voters. We just acquired some new voting machines this year, the Dominion ICX voting machines. They all have to accommodate Spanish and Filipino voters. We also have new electronic poll books, and again, those have to accommodate Spanish and Tagalog speakers. But in addition to that, looking towards the future, this equipment also has to accommodate character-based languages such as Mandarin. And you can see on the slide on the right is the voting machine, on the left is the electronic poll book. Yes, it's a little hard to see though. Early voting sites and our vote centers are selected to make sure that all voters, including Hispanic, Latino, and Filipino communities, have a convenient opportunity to vote before or on election day. So we are careful about selecting those sites. Early voting is very big in Clark County, so we are especially careful about that. More than 50% of people vote early than on election day in Clark County. The sites for both early voting and election day are approved by the county commissioners. As far as poll workers for both early voting and election day, we have Spanish-speaking poll workers at every single site. We may have more depending on the area where the site is. As far as Tagalog speakers for early voting, we have them at the larger sites. On election day, they are stationed at one site, but they rove within a 5-mile radius, so they go where they are needed. We do test the workers for language proficiency just by talking to them, so it's a very casual type of test. They wear large badges at the polling place so that people who do need assistance can easily see who to approach. And we recruit these workers through community organizations. We do some advertising in Asian and Latino media, such as newspapers. Translation for us is done in 2 ways. We have it in-house and contracted out. The in-house translation is for simple things and things that need a quick turnaround. We do not have dedicated translation staff. Everyone who does translation does other things as well. But we do encourage these employees to take advanced classes to keep their skills up, such as advanced grammar. One person who is the Tagalog translator, she is going to take some certified translator classes, and she's going to be certified in that. We use the Trados software to develop a glossary of terms so we don't have to keep translating things over and over again. The translations that we contract out are for ballot questions and more complicated type of material. We give that type of stuff usually to court translators. And as far as our website, we do not use Google Translate. Human beings translate that. And I have a final tip here. For printed materials, you often have to put Tagalog and Spanish in the same space as the English, but it takes up a lot more room, such as on voter registration forms. What we did is we acquired the Clearview text fonts, and they have some variations such as regular, condensed, and compressed. And the compressed I often use for the Tagalog forms that we use, and it works quite well. So, in summary, we have community outreach is proactive and developed through a variety of sources. Our voting machines have to accommodate current and future needs. Early voting and vote center sites are chosen very carefully. Our bilingual poll workers are tested for their skills, and we have at least one Spanish-speaking worker at every site, and Tagalog speaking workers are deployed where we think there's a need. And translation is completed in-house, and we also contract it out. And as far as forms and things with limited space, for a relatively small investment, we did buy some specialized fonts for that. That really helps. And that is it for me.
So Rosalyn is our last speaker, so start thinking about your questions. You can ask the panelists up here.
Good morning. I'm Rosalyn Gold, and on behalf of the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, that's the NALEO Educational Fund, I first want to thank the Election Assistance Commission, Democracy Fund, Voice, and the Pastor Center for bringing this summit together and for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion this morning. Our mission at the NALEO Educational Fund is to facilitate full Latino participation in the American political process. So language access for Latinos and other minority language voters is really critical to us achieving our mission. And in my presentation, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things to help set the context for the discussion moving forward. First of all, I just want to again highlight why effective language assistance is good for democracy, but also good for election administration. I'm also I like data too, so I'm going to give you a bit of data about the Latino community and the growth, where growth in limited English proficiency, voting age citizens has occurred in the last 5 years or so. I'm then going to talk about just an overview of some of the detailed things that Julie just illustrated so well in terms of ongoing issues as well as evolving issues in language assistance. And then I'm going to end up talking about just what happens if you don't comply. What are some of the enforcement mechanisms out there for violations of the Voting Rights Act? Well, just coming back to the place where we started this dialogue, why do we provide language assistance? Why is it important for our democracy? Well, I think it's important to remember, especially for people who work with elections a lot, and we're very familiar with them, that actually voting in the United States is not always easy. It can be quite complicated. I really hate to pick on my home state of California, but I'm going to do it. In our last primary election, we had 27 candidates for governor and 32 for U.S. senator. Our voter information guide was 96 pages. Yes, so with all of the ballot measures and all of the text. So even for people who are fully proficient in English, who have a lot of education, this can be daunting to get the information you need to cast an informed ballot. Our nation recognized that there are people who have not had the same educational opportunities, who have suffered discrimination, and therefore it is our obligation, if we want our democracy to be robust, to ensure that every eligible citizen can vote, even if they are not yet fully proficient in English. Why is it good for election administration? It just makes things move more smoothly, okay? If you have a polling site with good translated materials, good signage, well-trained bilingual poll workers, your operations move smoothly. There's much less voter confusion. So it's really good for jurisdictions and to make the election process and election administration work well. Right, so like I said, I just want to show you some data about the increase in the Spanish-speaking, limited English proficient, voting age citizen population between 2011 and 2016. And first, I just wanted to show you the top 12 counties by the increase in the numbers of LEP, Spanish-speaking citizen voting age population. And some of this is like no surprise. Yes, Miami-Dade County, Florida, Los Angeles, Harris County, Texas, Dallas, Bronx County. These are all areas where you've had traditional LEP, Spanish-speaking populations. And at the same time, some of the areas that also had large growth are interesting to watch. We're particularly interested in Central Florida, Orange County, Florida, because we know that the hurricanes in Puerto Rico have probably had an impact on people moving to Central Florida and other parts of the United States. And that's going to affect who has to provide language assistance and the growth of the population. I also just looked at the increase in percentage, taking like as a minimum of, you had to at least 4,000 voting age citizens, Spanish-speaking CVAP, limited English proficiency, to show you some of the emerging areas. You might notice the top two are in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, the district and Prince George County, Maryland. Other places are in the Central Valley of California, and then you also see like Travis County, Texas, which is near Austin. So, economic trends, job trends, mobility trends, all will be affecting the future of where we provide language assistance. As I mentioned, I wanted to take, a high-level view of some of the ongoing and emerging language assistance and access issues. First of all, I wanted to make you available of a resource that we have worked on with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the Fair Election Center. We're going to be putting out a handbook on best practices. If you want to get a sneak peek over at the resource table, there are fact sheets that you can pick up, and stay tuned because we will be releasing releasing this in a few weeks. Also, a shout out to the Election Assistance Commission glossaries and resources that the EAC provides. So, I could probably just, do this very easily by saying, listen to everything Julie said if you want to know about ongoing language access issues, right? You start by knowing your community. You not only use data, you talk to your community-based organizations. You need to invest time and resources in developing relationships with those organizations. It does not happen overnight. A lot of jurisdictions that are newly covered, we hear from them, well, we invite people to our meetings and nobody comes. No, you just have to keep over and over again reaching out, and then, as Julie mentioned, people will come to you. Community organizations are really important for all of the aspects of what you do in terms of language aspects, whether it's help with translations, outreach, poll worker training and recruitment, troubleshooting with operations. So that's time well spent in building relationships. And then also, again, as Julie mentioned, you have to have good mechanisms for evaluation and accountability, constantly monitoring, see what works, see what can be improved. Involving language access issues. Well, technology is great. It's made voting more accessible. But if you're going to be talking about technology, you need to bake in language access to anything you do in terms of your technological improvements or new use of new technology. Can't be having operations people here separate and your language access people here in another place. These people should be talking to each other all the time when you adopt and utilize new technological approaches. I'm glad Julie mentioned that she does not use Google Translate. We are very aware of some jurisdictions that for their websites think they're doing language assistance compliance by using Google Translate. Going beyond the minimum legal requirements, another emerging issue. It's not just important because it's good for communities. It's also important because that's, again, how you build relationships with communities you may eventually be covered with. And then finally, I know one of our other speakers have alluded to this, we have a very challenging political environment now that could affect how you need to be able to talk to your stakeholders and your community and your constituents about language assistance and why it's important. So be prepared for that. Finally, what happens if you don't comply? Well, the Department of Justice can bring actions under the Voting Rights Act, not only Section 203, but actions have been brought under Section 208, which requires people to be able to bring in somebody to help them personally with assistance at the polls. Section 4E, which deals with language assistance for Puerto Ricans. If you want to have a good read of how these cases are settled, also like what you shouldn't do, I gave you the website for the various settlements and memoranda of agreement. Just very interestingly, relatively robust enforcement during the Bush and Obama administrations than we have seen, at least so far, with the Trump administration. And then the other, in addition to the Department of Justice, private actions, which are brought on behalf of individuals or tribal councils or community groups, civil rights and private attorneys bring these. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this, I believe, when we hear about what's going on in Alaska, because that's a prime example of private actions. So where do I want to just end up? I just want to, again, really emphasize that it's really important that we really make this a priority in all the work that we do in election administration. I also wanted to come back to what John had mentioned about the census and really making sure we have a full count, an accurate and fair Census 2020. And we are facing a very serious threat to that. There is the proposal by the Department of Commerce to add a question on citizenship. This last-minute addition could really end up with really bad census data. If you go to our website, www.naleo.org, there's information on how you can submit comments. They're due by August 7th. Please, please, if you haven't done so, submit comments opposing the addition of the citizenship question. We need good data to make language access work, so we really would like to join you in the effort to make that happen. Thank you.
All right, so I will open it up for questions in the audience. we have none, I'm more than happy to start questioning folks.
Oh, right.
Okay, while you all, oh, please.
Good morning. So I had a question about the census. When we had the first mid-decade census, it kind of surprised people, not because it was coming out, but some of the determinations. So there were many jurisdictions that anticipated coverage and didn't receive it. And then there were other jurisdictions. I was in Arizona at the time, and we had a real kind of shakeup of the coverage in some of our native countries. So I'm curious, you had mentioned that there was some tweaks done after the last census. And I'm wondering, with the 2020, if you anticipate there being some changes to that algorithm moving into 2025. And I'm hoping that the answer is yes.
Yes, so every time we start the Section 203 determination process, because it's such a big gap between when we do it each time, and it was for the first time we had a mid-decade release of those determinations this time for the first time because of that change to the ACS, which provided more current data, which made it actually possible to do that. We actually institute a research project through our Research and Methodology Directorate at the Census Bureau. It's sponsored by my office as program managers, but it's actually chaired by the Associate Director for Research and Methodology, and he brings in his best and brightest, and they go through the process of trying to determine what is the best way with the limited data that we have, because what we're basically doing is measuring, in a lot of cases, especially when you're talking about the American Indian and Alaska Native populations, you're measuring very small populations in very small areas, which when you're doing a sample survey, obviously can create a disconnect, a discord there. So they'll look at that starting in December of 2019 to evaluate the methodology, to see what's appropriate, to see if there are things that that need to be tweaked to make sure that the methodology works appropriately. We do try to do this in the most fair and equitable way, in the sense of we never actually run it on current data when we're developing this. We always use old data because we don't want to actually ever have the appearance of sort of putting our thumb on the scale for anything. But yes, we will revisit that, both for 2020, the ones that will come out in 2021, and again, the next cycle.
Hi, good morning. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I'm a PhD in economics by training, but I'm interested in a lot of social issues. I actually participate running for public office since 1994, including in Maryland, from local to federal, local mayor, and Maryland State Senate, and Maryland's Comptroller, and U.S. Congress, and U.S. Senate. So I practically know about the process. So I think it's very important that people vote. The problem is people say, why do I vote? The system will not change. So I think it's important to help them solve the problem. So they will say, this makes some difference. And the second is, it's not just a voter to vote, but also the system, the election office. They say if they want to vote for somebody, but they change the voting, their vote. Like Maryland, they have a distinguished primary election and general election, but they cannot cross the parties. So if you don't have sign up as a Democrat, you cannot vote for Democrat candidates. And if you want to vote for Republican, but if you are registered, if you receive a ballot, it's not for Republican. So you cannot change your party, and you cannot vote for the person you want. And second is, and then the next is voter status. The system goes this way. If they don't want you to be a candidate, they can remove you away from this area. Or if you are a voter, they can remove your area, or you will be incarcerated. Everything is very complicated. So if you are the voters, you must make them aware of the problem, and maybe should have somebody to contact with. I have been affiliated with many civil organizations, but it's very difficult to make this facilitate their interest to vote. So I just hope we can make this facilitate their interest to vote and to be a candidate. And the final thing is you must have a candidate information available to them and then make them aware. They see the candidate face and the voice. The problem is system away the candidate not allow them to speak, not allow them to vote. So I hope we can take care of all these problems, and I hope we can make a success, make something different for our societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. I think really the first point you make is really critical when we think about language access and full participation in our democracy. Language access is critical, but it's not the only thing that we need for groups that are not yet fully participating. Based on our work with the Latino community, we know we have a very simple formula. It says information plus invitation equals participation. Now, language access is really that important part of that information, right? People need to understand the electoral process. They need to understand how to navigate it. They need to feel that if they go to vote, that they're going to have a welcoming, accessible environment. But there also has to be outreach, educating people, talking to people about why casting a vote is so important for the issues that affect their families, issues that affect their neighborhoods, issues that affect their communities. Election officials do that outreach, but so do, there's lots of nonprofit voter engagement work that's done by organizations like us, like Asian Americans Advancing Justice has a very strong nonpartisan voter engagement. And it's really about connecting with the community and saying, hey, here's the issues that affect you. Here's why casting a ballot is important. So like I said, it's information plus invitation gets participation.
Good morning. This question is for Julie. I'm Laura from Dallas County, and I was wondering, do you have a different pay rate for your bilingual poll workers?
Actually, it depends. If the job description includes bilingual skills are required, then they do not get paid extra. However, if we use staff that does not have bilingual in their job description, but we're still using them for bilingual purposes, then they do get an increase in pay as long as they can pass a test in that language. So the person who does our Tagalog fits into that category. She had to pass a test for Tagalog, and she does get a bump in her pay for that.
And do you do, like in California, like they give appreciation, like they do buttons or a certificate, anything else after the election for the poll workers?
Oh, for the
encouragement, yes. California uses the buttons, or some other counties use
for the bilingual poll workers, you mean?
Yes. Or in Dallas, we have the high school program, which we give out the certificates and just to appreciate them.
Well, we send out certificates of appreciation to all poll workers, not just bilingual. Personally, I think maybe we should do a little bit more for our bilingual poll workers. They are paid the same as everybody else. And although during early voting, the hours can vary, and I actually do run an early voting site, so I'm very familiar how polling places work, and I give my bilingual workers more hours, so they are paid more, and I need them more.
And I just want to comment on the best practice of thinking about high school or college students as poll workers. It's not only do you have that good energy, you have people who can be very familiar with technology, but being a poll worker really is a first step to voting and participating. And so that's just one thing to think seriously about when you're looking at how you want to staff your polling sites.
And I know we've heard from former, in previous summits from other elections officials, where they've talked about the pay rate being the same, but perhaps they have to do extra training so that they might get additional funding because they have to do that extra training as the bilingual poll workers.
Also, in California, they use residents for bilinguals, poll workers, and that's something that we would like to see in Texas. But do you see the difference in only hiring the citizenships or residents? Does anybody have an opinion?
We are finding in California, if you have legal permanent residency, you can be a poll worker. And so again, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen. It's sufficient to have legal permanent residency. We are still in the process of educating election officials about changing the materials and how they recruit people, changing the application forms, but we're seeing some slow progress in that area, and it really does help, especially when you have emerging language communities. And California also has its own set of language access requirements, so that law has helped in that respect as well.
In Nevada, poll workers need to be registered voters, therefore U.S. citizens. So at this point in time, we are not able to use people who are not citizens at the polling places.
Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for their presentations, but one thing that I noticed was Ms. Barker said that for the minority languages you use opt-in, an affirmative opt-in for people to get the materials, and in a number of counties that was one of the red flags that brought us to bring lawsuits, that very few people opted in, and I'd like to know how important you think that your outreach efforts have been to get the numbers up where they should be so they're more comparable to the census numbers for how many people actually need the materials.
I think the outreach efforts have been very important with that, because when we do go out to community events, we also register voters. We also go to citizenship ceremonies to register voters as well. So yeah, it has helped the outreach considerably. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Do you happen to know the numbers?
The numbers.
Or the ratios for the people who opt in for the materials versus the census data?
Yes, I do. I checked that out before I came out here. The way we determine if somebody wants language materials is two ways. They contact us and let us know, or on the registration forms, there's a box to check off for language preference. So for Spanish language, we have about 12,500 people who have indicated a preference for Spanish. For Tagalog, it's about 650.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question on behalf of Rob Mason, stating experience his deaf mother had. She didn't know how to use the latest touch-based voting machine and asked a polling place employee to show her how to use the machine. The supervisor, captain of the polling place, came and did something on the machine and told his mother to go home, and that was it. So his mother protested, "I haven't voted yet," but the supervisor told her to go home. And he suggested, the son, suggested that she should file a formal complaint with the local and state board of elections. I'm not sure if that happened, but that was back in 2004, and it seems that the supervisor actually voted for her. This was in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. So he's giving this as an example of experience that many deaf people have with confusing processes at polling places, poll workers that are either unequipped or unwilling to provide in-depth assistance for disabled voters. So I suppose this is a question for any panelist to respond to with regards to what needs to change to ensure that disabled voters have full access and assistance necessary at the polling place.
I can comment on that. I have dealt with deaf voters in Clark County. We specifically train our poll workers on how to process disabled voters. We have a video that we put out online on that, and it is in their training materials. So we do specifically train them in those issues.
Oh, I just wanted to comment, just as language access needs to be baked in to your election administration and your operations, access for voters with disabilities also has to be something that you're constantly thinking about whether it's, again, with your voting equipment, how you train your poll workers, how you do outreach. Just as an advisory group on language access issues is important. Similarly, an advisory group and working with community organizations that serve voters with disabilities is really critical.
I have one more comment about that, too. We do work with groups that are disability advocates, and that has been very helpful for us in developing our materials for voters with disabilities.
I mean, I guess one other thing I would mention is under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act, you're allowed an assister of your choice. Right. So if that is one thing that certainly we as community organizers try to remind our people, is that you could bring someone with you, and that will help in the process. And then if that person is denied access or denied to provide assistance, that's another grounds for filing a complaint or looking into other further recourse.
Oh, over.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tarika, and I'm an attorney advisor for the DC Board of Elections, as well as the Language Access Coordinator. And in regards to the person who had the question about disabilities and how we assist voters with disabilities, one thing that we do here in DC is we also recruit poll workers from the disability rights community. And so when you have voters with disabilities inside the polling places, they tend to be more attentive. They tend to provide better service to our voters that have disabilities when they have poll workers who are also there with disabilities. And also, we don't just focus on the census numbers as far as languages, Spanish, Vietnamese, etc. We also focus on where we have voters with disabilities, such as people who are deaf, and we have poll workers that, not poll workers, I'm sorry, we have sign language interpreters assigned to all those polling places. And that way, voters who come in that need that assistance, they are aware that they have that kind of assistance, and they don't feel so isolated in the process. And also educating people about what services you offer. So on each door, we'll put, hey, if you have any kind of language access need, if you need a sign language interpreter, here's the number to call. And even if you're in a part of the city where we don't have a high number of folks that need sign language interpreters, we can transport someone to your site. So I just think I'm so happy that you guys also kind of mesh the two, because it's essential that we also provide assistance for voters with disabilities, because they also have a lot of need, like voters that also need different languages.
So, Julie, let me ask you to follow up on that. How exactly is, I guess, language assistance incorporated into the poll worker training? I know one recommendation that we often hear is that language assistance should be something that's sort of, as to borrow Rosalyn's term, baked in, right? So that you're training all of your poll workers, right, on language assistance, not just the bilingual poll workers, so that people understand how to properly assist voters with needs, whether that is language, whether that is, from a disability rights standpoint. How do you all go about doing that?
Well, what we do is we train the poll workers to know that there is going to be a Spanish-speaking poll worker who will assist people who need it, as well as the Tagalog speakers. So, and these people have very large badges, so they're easily identifiable. But poll workers know that they have to direct voters to that person if they see the person is having problems. If the voter may not say outright that they need help, but you can tell. And so they need to be looking for that. So that's basically what we do.
Great. Adam?
Hi, Adam Ambrogi, Democracy Fund Voice. Ms. Barker referenced relying at times or looking to the court's translation system as a potential model. I was wondering, given that many courts have a more sort of robust emergency translation system for the judicial processes, are there ways that smaller jurisdictions can find a backstop in looking to how their courts use translation to assist sort of last-minute needs for their voters? Are there any examples that you have using that court system for election processes?
Well, yes, we use court translators, and they do this aside from their court work. But they're certified translators for the court, and we use them for ballot questions because it's difficult for our staff to spend a lot of time on these ballot questions and documents with a lot of legal terminology. So we do use them for that purpose mainly. The problem with it is that the turnaround is slow, so we have to give them that material way in advance. And of course, as I said, in-house, it's things that we need more quickly and that are easier to translate.
Rosalyn, I wanted to ask you really quickly, you talked about sort of the accountability and sort of evaluation methods. Can you give some maybe best practices or tips that you think are important for jurisdictions to keep in mind as they think through their language assistance program?
So first of all, you should have both formal mechanisms for monitoring what happens, keeping track of what you're doing, the number of people you're deploying, when your trainings occur, what your processes are. First of all, it's partly just keeping records, but then watching for outcomes. What is working, what happens if there's a problem, kind of debriefing afterwards and saying, hey, this didn't go as smoothly as we thought. Is it just a glitch, or is it really something that's systematic? So just constantly, monitoring what you're doing, taking feedback, talking to your community groups, and then using that to improve your systems. You just have that constant synergy of getting that information and using it, and then getting more information and using it.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to close out the session with a question to John and James. And thinking about looking towards 2021 and just looking to the future of language needs, what are things that people should be thinking about as we continue the conversation today about how we can go beyond 203 or different ways that we can try to make sure that that all voters are indeed served?
Actually, I would probably just sum up some of the things that have been mentioned in this panel. Number one is building out these partnerships, because I think you guys are absolutely right. It takes time, and it takes repeated efforts, especially if you're working with some of these small nonprofits that are going to be critical to the work. They have a lot of turnover. They have capacity problems. And so if you just call one meeting and no one shows up, you're absolutely right. That doesn't mean there's no interest. It just means that the one person that has that capacity wasn't able to make it that day. I mean, that's the reality of it. So it does require that repeated effort. Absolutely, looking at those just missed jurisdictions is a great starting point in terms of figuring out where your needs are going to be. And frankly, I think a lot of you know what your needs are going to be, even independent of that data. Because if you're out in the community, as your jobs will require you to be, you will have a feel for that, and really talking to the community members, going to the community cultural fairs, and figuring that out, and then figuring out how to do that in a culturally competent way. Because I think, it's interesting, as I listen to Nevada sort of talk about whether it's in sort of a traditional Chinese characters or simplified Chinese characters. I mean, that's an important question for the Chinese community, because there's an increasing divide there. So definitely sort of those are the types of things you can be doing now as you build out towards 2020, 2021.
And I would just say for the Census Bureau and the actual calculations of the Section 203 determinations, these are something that we take very seriously at the Census Bureau. It's one of the few authorities that's given to the Census Bureau directly to the director and not through the Secretary of Commerce and then down to the Census Bureau. And our directors that I've worked under for both of these have taken it very seriously. So if there's, if you have thoughts or if you have ideas of things we can do to help support you in your work with these determinations, and you can identify them for us, my office is always available, and we want to hear that. We will start this process again in December of 2019 for an expected publication in December of 2021. It's a long process, but if the earlier we hear from you about your concerns, then we can make sure that they're addressed and that we can incorporate that into the research that we do as we go about the next round of creating these vital statistics.
Great, thank you. And join me in thanking our panelists for our first panel today. And turning it back over.